Hello, and welcome to Seafood Matters Podcast, the voice of the UK seafood industry. I'm your host, Jim Cowie. Hi there, welcome to Seafood Matters Podcast. I'm delighted to be speaking today with Ray Hilborn from the University of Washington, if I think correctly, but welcome to the show, Ray, and I would love you to tell our listeners just about where you've come from, what you've done, and how you're doing now.
Okay, thanks. It's it's a pleasure to be here. And so my background is I started off my career as a terrestrial ecologist. I did a PhD in 1974 at the University of British Columbia, working on population dynamics of field mice. Um, and over time, I moved into fisheries. I was working for the Canadian Department of fisheries and environment on both things in the fish world and in the land world. And my specialty was population dynamics, and particularly the quantitative parts of that. That is an analysis of the numbers. And what I found over time was that the fisheries problems were far more interesting. Um, and there was actually a place that the managers were actually using what I did. So I sort of transitioned to working largely on fisheries, but not exclusively, all the way through the mid 1980s, and then I went for 2 years to an international organization that does the science for tunas in the Western Pacific, and spent 2 years working on tunas, and then came to the University of Washington in 1987. So that's now 35 years that I've been here as a professor, teaching courses and writing books about the status of fish populations and how to manage them. Oh yeah, yeah. And I originally most of my work was in how you estimate the status of fish stocks and how the allowable harvest. But for the last, then I sort of transitioned to a lot more work on global status fisheries, trying to understand what's going on where and what the causes of why some stocks are doing well and some are not. And in the last 10 years or so, an additional focus on the environmental impacts of food production, and really started out by just comparing fisheries to
Yeah,
agriculture,
a massive subject.
and asking which of these has a lower environmental footprint.
Yeah, yeah. I've read some of your pieces and articles on that, and I have to say it's one of the things that I have to say I like about it is your approach, which is not this doom and gloom, and you actually include nature in it, which a lot of people don't. And I don't know if it's the same in the US, but in this country, the Greenpeace and bodies like that, everything they talk about is overfishing. It's and our fleet, Ray, is about a fraction of the size it was.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I'm aware of that, and um, well, part of and I'd say it's that my approach isn't the lack of doom and gloom. That's really the results of the work that we've done. So that's sort of how I move from really the technical aspects of fisheries management to looking at the big picture. Is back in 2006, a paper appeared in Science magazine. It made the front page of the New York Times, made the BBC Evening Television News, that said if current trends continue, all fish stocks would be collapsed by 2048. And that was so contrary to my experience in fisheries that I and quite a few others wrote critiques of that paper's claim, and ultimately I collaborated with several of the authors of that paper to say, look, let's get together and really understand what the trend in fish stocks is. And we did that collaboratively. And in 2009, we published a paper together showing that when we looked at the abundance of fish stocks, where we had good data, um, that they weren't declining on average, that they were quite stable. And since then, we've expanded that database and kept it more or less current. And we can show now that for the half of the fisheries of the world where we have data on abundance, they're actually going up, not down. Um, Certainly, overfishing was a problem quite globally in the 90s. I mean, certainly in Europe, I would say probably most European fisheries were subject to overfishing. That's probably still true for the Mediterranean fisheries, but European Atlantic fisheries overfishing has been dramatically reduced. Certainly not eliminated. And on average, European fisheries, Atlantic fisheries, which are the big ones, are increasing.
That's really interesting. Yeah, yeah. And what? How do you? How do you? What's your science?
Well, for those kinds of analysis, we basically assemble all the assessments done by national, international fisheries agencies. So this is what's called a stock assessment. And what they do is they use all of the data on catches from scientific surveys, on age and length. Those are the dominant items. And they put all that together and come up with a best estimate of the trend in abundance, catch, and fishing pressure. The fraction harvested, as well as set targets for what the abundance should be and what the fishing pressure should be. Uh, and so what we've done is we've simply assembled all of those. So in the case of the UK, it's pretty well all done by ICES, the international agency that does Northeast Atlantic fisheries, and they do assessments of almost all the major fisheries of European Atlantic on a regular basis, and we simply download their data and then add that to the same kind of data from the U.S., from Canada, from all the countries, from the international tuna agencies, um, from FAO, and all the places, and put all that data together. And as I say, we cover about half of the world's fish catch. What we don't have is reliable trend data for Southeast Asia. That's the big gap in our data.
Okay. Yeah. The We have a situation in the UK just now where you're right, as you say, ICES, uh, the government uses, and for example, this one species cod. Now, ICES have recommended a 44% increase in the cod quota for 2023 next year. Now, some fishermen say, well, okay, 44% seems a lot, but it's 44% of what's starting at a very little figure because it's been reduced so much over in the past few years. But so 44% ICES are recommending as an increase in the cod quota for the UK for next year. And at the same time, we've got, as I said, bodies like Greenpeace and Marine Conservation Society, people like that, saying that it's overfishing and it's almost in extinction. Now, adding that two together, our fishermen, just now are finding there's so much cod on the grounds. Even the lobster and crab creel fishermen are catching cod in their creels.
Yeah, well, I'm glad I did. I wasn't aware that there'd been a real boom in cod, at least in the southern cod stocks. I know Iceland's been doing well, Barents Sea has been doing well, so that's really good news. But I mean, you have to appreciate that Greenpeace makes its money by scaring people about the state of the ocean, uh, and they're they have no use for science unless it happens to tell them what is their narrative. And that's true of some of the environmental NGOs, but certainly not all. There's some very responsible environmental NGOs, and I work very closely with some of their staff. But as you say, for some of the NGOs, scaring the public is how they make their money.
And unfortunately, they're good at it because they've got a voice and the public wear it.
Oh yeah, yeah, you bet. Um, and just an ongoing problem. And one of the other problems is that for so long that their message has been pretty successful. And as I said, in the 1990s, it was largely true. I mean, things were not going extinct, but we were overfishing. That there's a whole generation of young people have gone through university, gone through for secondary school, they've gone through university being told that the oceans are being emptied of fish. And many of them are now uh, working for these NGOs, or they're working, some of them are working even in government, and they've come in with this with this predilection to think that the oceans are being emptied of fish. But we've certainly made, I would say we've made a lot of progress that that almost the entire science community, including many who would have said the oceans are being emptied of fish, will now accept that in places where we are managing our fisheries intensively, stocks are rebuilding. And so I consider that a major change in perspective over the last 15 years.
Yeah. And when you talk about the global uh, trends and the stats you come up with, is that multi-species or single species?
Well, I mean, all of our analysis has been looking at trends, species, and area specifically. So I think we have the data on Atlantic cod in 15 regions. So we look at each of those, and they're often different. So as I said, Icelandic cod, Barents Sea cod have been doing well for several decades. Western Atlantic cod, none of them are doing well. The big one that collapsed in the 1990s, the so-called northern Newfoundland cod, has been rebuilding, but it's not nearly where everybody would like to see it. But we take all these individual assessments and we put them together to say, okay, what is the big trend? Are stocks on average increasing, or are they on average decreasing? And on average, where we have data, again, missing South and Southeast Asia, they're increasing.
Yeah. What's your views on some stocks or predator stocks?
Um, well, I mean that's true. I mean some fish eat other fish, uh, and so one of the things that the people who study ecosystem interactions suggest is that uh, we have typically fished the predatory fish harder than the lower fish, sometimes called forage fish. Um, and certainly in the temperate regions, that pressure is quite different. And the people who study these things suggest that the abundance of the prey species has actually increased because we have fished their predators down Uh, so there was a paper coming out of University of British Columbia about 10, 12 years ago, entitled something like 100 Years of Change in Ocean Ecosystems, that looked at the predatory fish, and it said that they've probably declined by 60% or so in the last 100 years. And remember, that's the level that you would predict would produce maximum sustainable yield. It's about somewhere between 30 and 50% of their former abundance. But that the things they eat, the so-called forage fish, would be twice as abundant now. Um, and I have to admit, I'm a little skeptical, because you remember what that's because there are so many more forage fish in the ocean, either in numbers or biomass, than there are of their predators. It's sort of a 10-to-1 ratio. That says there's more fish in the ocean now than 100 years ago, which, I've talked to other people who this is more their specialty, and they're a little skeptical of that. But the idea that the prey species have increased because we've differentially fished their predators, I think, has a lot of support.
Do you think temperatures have a hand in it? Water temperatures?
Yeah, well, water temperatures changing, and so we're seeing climate change is causing a lot of changes in fisheries. The two things are, in almost in general, fish are moving towards the poles. They're following the temperature. As it gets warmer, they're going farther north in the northern hemisphere. They're going farther south in the southern hemisphere. The other thing that's changing is some stocks are benefiting from the warming, and some are losing. So, two of the fisheries I'm very familiar with here in the U.S., the two of the most important fisheries in the United States. One is salmon, sockeye salmon. I think it's the fourth most economically valuable fishery in the U.S. And we've just had a record year. There was more sockeye. We caught more sockeye salmon this year than at any time in history. And we
Wow.
couldn't catch them all. There was a lot of them out there. At the same time, 100 miles away, they've had to close two of our major crab fisheries, because they've had a terrible last couple of years have been terrible for them, and the scientists who work on it believe that's because of the what we call the marine heat wave, that it just was too hot for them. Whereas for our sockeye salmon, the warmer conditions have been good.
That's why it's a temperature that it's felt in this country, or this area, why the northern, if you could imagine, say, north of Scotland, by Shetland, up by Faroe Islands and Iceland. That's why cod is. Some fishermen are saying there's cod where they've never seen it before in abundance.
Yeah, I was in the Shetlands in April, and I heard them say that they were just having trouble, matching because the quotas they have were really designed for the distribution of fish at the time the Common Fisheries Policy was designed, and so the quotas have gotten out of sync. That they've got too much of some things and too little of others.
Yeah, that's right. And there were fears at one stage that there was maybe the reason I asked you about the predator stock, because they reckon that whiting whiting classed as a predator stock, and with a mesh size, any increase in mesh size would mean that mature, although maybe immature cod would escape, so would mature, because it's a smaller size and overall it's mature whiting would escape, and they would be eating the baby cod and haddock and stuff. But there was a study done on it, and they found no cod or haddock in the stomachs of the whiting.
Is that right? No, well, that's something that has to be done very regionally and specifically. And I mean, we have issue with our biggest stock, the second most valuable fishery in the United States, no, the third most, Alaska pollock. So we catch about 1.3 million tons. So that's a lot of fish. Um, and they're very big predators on their own juveniles. Uh, and so one of the concerns is that sometimes we see the population increase and get large, and then that really whacks down the recruitment in subsequent years. And so that's a subject of a lot of interest. Um,
I've had a scientist from Iceland reckon that can be a sign of overpopulation.
well, that's what some people are arguing, that we should not let the pollock population get that big because it's going to reduce the future recruitment to the population. I'm not sure how widely accepted that is, but it's certainly a possibility.
Yeah, yeah. With that other species, we have a situation here as well. There's industrial fishing of sand eels by Danish boats, and mainly it's for use in agriculture, feeding pigs and fertilizer and stuff. And the feeling with fishermen is that that's the feed, that's the fish's food, and if that if that wasn't, if they were allowed to not be worth, if they weren't, I mean, I think it's 80,000 ton is their quota this year, and they just feel. What's your thoughts on the principle that could be food for our fish rather than for pig farms?
Well, we've done a lot of work looking at the impact of fishing, what are called forage fish, things like sand eels, sardines, herring, anchovies, much of which it goes both into human consumption and into fish meal and fish oil. We've looked specifically at the impact of the abundance of the forage fish on their predators, both fish and birds and marine mammals. And we find very little relationship that the forage fish abundance is almost totally driven by the environment. Fishing plays very little role in the actual abundance of those stocks. I mean, on sometimes when the quotas get out of whack and the stock has some bad years, fishing can drive the population down a lot faster. But in general, there is very little correlation between the abundance of the food and the growth rate of the predators. That's just an empirical observation that we've published several papers on. So I'm skeptical that there is a tight connection. Almost all the arguments for a tight connection have been mostly based on models. Although there are certainly some exceptions, mostly in the bird world. Uh, there are clearly some bird populations that are very dependent upon the forage fish in around their nesting sites. Um, but more broadly for fish, I would be skeptical because you know there's a whole bunch of different kinds of food out there, and usually if you look at the stomach contents of the fish in particular, when let's say sand eels go down, they simply switch and feed on something else. But again, all of these things need to be looked at individually in you know case by case. And we've just done the big survey around the world for all the data sets we could find, and we don't find much relationship.
Okay, so you don't see, yeah, possibly would justifies the fact that they're giving a quota out, but
Yeah, certainly there have been been, I mean, there's a lot of people who think we should not fish all of these forage fish, sardines, herrings, mackerel, sand eels, and because of the benefits they provide to ecosystems. And all we've done is simply looked and saying, what's the evidence that that really affects their predators? And we don't find a lot. There are, in some cases, there is, but in general, it hasn't seemed to make much difference.
Okay. Okay. We sometimes find here that fish can be thin and out of condition at times of the year when they should be a bit fatter and
Mm-hmm.
far more better condition. And it's all often feared that it is something to do with the available food.
Oh, that. I mean, that's a very likely explanation. But there's lots of. I mean, it could be a combination of what their food is. It could be just the distribution of food. It could be that where their traditional fish food species are has changed and they're not in the right place at the right time. And it could be, certainly you see fish tend to grow slower when there are lots of them. So they're competing for food. Um,
Yeah, one of the important species on that on with us around our shores is the herring, because uh, we have a saying, just it's just finished now, just maybe a few weeks. They call them spawnies,
hmm,
and it was haddock, spawny haddock, but they're actually the herring have spawned, and hake and herring and haddock and species like that. When their fishermen are getting them, they're full of herring spawn.
hmm. Yeah, that's I mean, it's out in the ocean. Almost everything eats everything else. It seems like anything that's in the same place and big enough to put in your mouth, you're going to eat.
Well, there's been I'm sure you've seen it in some ways yourself. There's been recordings here with cod with coke can, coke cans in their stomach.
Ugh, ugh. Yeah, yeah, there's that too. Mhm.
Eh, if we can ask you about your points of view on the, as I said, 2016 debacle with Greenpeace, where you were attacked uh, or broadsided for your defending the fishing industry.
Yeah, and I remember the day. It was 11th of May 2016, and Greenpeace launched a very aggressive campaign specifically against me, arguing that I had failed to disclose funding from the fishing industry in my scientific research. Um, and certainly, I, well, let me just step back. Over the years, I had inherited two research programs that had been significantly funded by the fishing industry. Um, one of them was started in 1946 on salmon in Alaska, um, and the other was started in about 1990 in a collaboration between my department and the New Zealand fishing industry. And in both cases, these were started by other people in my department, but when they left the department, I sort of inherited them. So I had been directing these two research programs that had significant funding from the fishing industry, and Greenpeace said I had not disclosed that when I published scientific papers that they were funded by the fishing industry, and I was able to show that indeed I had disclosed it if it was funded by the fishing industry. Now Greenpeace came back and said, well, because I've received funding by the fishing industry, I always have a conflict of interest, and I need to make that, even if the research had received no funding by the fishing industry, I have to say, but I am guilty of receiving funding by the fishing industry. Um, Now, the University of Washington did an investigation. Major international journals. I can't remember. I think Science, Nature, and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences all went over and agreed that where I had been funded by the fishing industry, I had I had declared that. So and also I have to say that my colleagues in the environmental NGOs really came to my rescue. As I know several of them said they were called by journalists wanting to know how serious this was, and they said no. He's straightforward, good scientist. So that totally went away. But the only actually, it's an interesting anecdote. The only journal that asked for a retroactive declaration of conflict was a journal called Public Library of Science. And I had been one of about 10 authors on a paper asking the very simple question, is are stocks certified by the Marine Stewardship Council in better shape than stocks that are not? And it seems pretty obvious, and the answer was obvious. Yes, on average, stocks certified by the Marine Stewardship Council are in better shape than stocks that are not. Now, I had not declared a conflict of interest, but the lead author on the paper worked for the Marine Stewardship Council. Okay, so when we submitted the paper, he declared, I've got a conflict of interest. I work for the MSC, and this paper is about the MSC. And the journal came back and said, no, that is not a conflict of interest because the Marine Stewardship Council is a non-governmental organization and it's a nonprofit. Therefore, somebody who works for a nonprofit can't have a conflict of interest, which is totally absurd. The idea that somebody from Greenpeace could publish an article on the status of fish stocks and not have a conflict of interest, given their organization has stated positions on the status of fish stocks, is ridiculous. Because I had never worked for the MSC, but I had worked for contractors who do Marine Stewardship Council certification. And so I think two other authors had to submit a retroactive saying, okay, we were paid to work on MSC certifications. But other than that, it totally blew over.
Okay. Oh, I thought they took you further than that.
No, 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 no. I mean, what I do now is I have a standard, so I publish about 8 or 10 papers a year, and I have just a standard thing saying, Ray Hilborn receives funding from environmental organizations, from environmental foundations, from governments, and from the fishing industry. All of these can be considered a potential conflict on any issue in fisheries. That just completely covers me on every paper. Because it just I mean that's part of my research strategy is to get funding from as broad a range of organizations as possible, and ideally collaborate with people from someone says, oh well, Ray Hilborn said that fish stocks are increasing. It's I didn't say that. 20 individual authors published a paper that said that. I was the first author, and among those authors were people who work for the Nature Conservancy, the Environmental Defense Fund, the Wildlife Conservation Society. So that's proved very I mean, it wasn't an intentional strategy. I just wanted, those people knew a lot, and we wanted to work together. But it's provided a lot of protection from those, from Greenpeace in particular.
Yeah. Eh, a lot of the views this side of the big pond is that they work with flawed, the word they use, and you would have heard it in Shetland, a flawed science.
Well, it depends on. I mean, now it gets very specific. There's certainly a lot of flaws in the scientific process. I mean, there's a lot of totally ridiculous papers that get published, um, that that I and people I work with seem to spend a lot of time writing critiques of papers that make it through the peer review process. Um, but even mainstream science published by good scientists, good organizations, turns out to be wrong in retrospect. Um, that scientists have gotten assessments wrong, and there's no question about that. But and but I don't. There's no systematic flaw. I don't see any systematic flaw in fishery science, but there's a lot of what I would call bogus science. I mean my perspective is, if a good scientist who knows the subject can point out that it was wrong at the time it was published, in other words, the reviewers did not do their job or were not competent to do the job, then those papers should be retracted. And we had a major success this year where a very high profile paper on marine protected areas, the journal actually retracted it, which says, we're sorry, we should not have published this paper. Um, but that's almost unknown in the fisheries world. It's happening more and more in the medical world, mostly due to true fraud, where people are making up data. Um, but that hasn't so far not been an issue in the fish world.
What's your views on marine protected areas?
Well, marine protected areas are one potential tool in the marine management toolbox, but I see them as having a pretty limited use. My way I like to look at it is, what is the threat and what is the solution? So uh, first, I think there's a growing consensus that for coastal fisheries, which would include almost all UK fisheries, the two biggest threats are climate change and things that come from the land. Coastal development, uh, sediment runoff, pollution. Um, and there's a very significant paper that came out 2 years ago, not by me or anyone I closely work with, that really showed that. It showed that fishing is really not a serious threat to marine ecosystems. Fishing is a concern for a small number of species that are threatened or endangered. Um, whereas marine protected areas are being sold as the most effective form of ocean protection, and yet marine protected areas really have done nothing but move fishing around. They haven't affected climate change. They haven't affected coastal impacts, terrestrial impacts on marine ecosystems, and they haven't reduced fishing pressure. All they've done is move it. So and the marine protected area literature is just full of very poor science. So the most common thing they do to show that marine protected areas increase abundance is to compare what happens to the abundance inside an area when you close it to fishing to what happens outside. And certainly, if fishing was going on in any intensity, the abundance inside will increase. Why did it increase? Because you're not catching them there, but you're fishing harder outside. So you can't use what happens outside as the control on what would have happened inside if you hadn't. So usually abundance goes up inside, abundance goes down outside because you're fishing harder outside. Um, so that's certainly one of my serious concerns about and reviewers just don't seem to apply good scientific analysis of those papers.
I couldn't agree with you more on that one. I come from a small fishing village in the east coast of Scotland, and it's a small sea area, firths we call them, and it's not a closed, but it's a small area surrounded by land. We called it the Murray Firth. And when I was a kid, now I'm in my 70s now. When I was a kid, my father was a fisherman, and that Murray Firth area, there was boats from right down one coast and right round the other. There was boats going out every day and catching fish in that area. Now there's not. They're all there's no boats left in that small fishing villages now. So, and any boat that ever goes into that area now, they never catch anything.
Well, so the question is, was it overfishing or was it impacts of terrestrial runoff or climate change?
It certainly wasn't overfishing because it's the fish. They stopped getting fish after the fishing stopped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, no, I
But
mean,
one of the problems we have in this part of the world is where the fishermen are losing ground, fishing grounds, to MPAs and renewables.
I think that's true the world over. Well, not the world over, but in most of the richer countries, um, both of those things are happening.
Is that right?
Oh
Have
yeah,
you
yeah, yeah. I mean,
experience?
certainly, when I was in Shetland, wind power was space allocation to wind power was a serious issue. It's certainly high on the fishermen's agenda in the U.S. and everywhere that wind power is being proposed, it's real concern that the fishermen are losing that space.
Yeah, it's the view here is they seem to they seem to want to put wind farms in either on land. It's our nicest beauty spots, or at sea it's our best fishing grounds.
Mm.
So, could I ask you about your publicised as repeatedly claiming Greenpeace overstated, amplify the negative effects of commercial fishing? I'd like to discuss the real world effects of greenwashing.
Um, well, that's it's a. I mean, this in this case, it's not a Greenpeace issue by in any sense. I mean, Greenpeace does that certainly, but it's one of the things that really frustrates most of us who do fisheries science is there's an incredible bias in what gets reported and and what even what makes it into the scientific literature. That essentially bad news sells, and good news and factual news that saying that fisheries are doing well in many places doesn't sell. So as I mentioned earlier, this paper came out in 2006 saying that if current trends continue, all fish stocks would be collapsed by 2048. And that made the BBC Evening News. It made the front page of the New York Times. It made the front page of the Washington Post. Um, many of those authors and I and a number of other people published a paper 3 years later saying, well, actually, it isn't true. Fish stocks seem to be stable, not declining. And that did not make the front page of any newspaper. We actually tried, and in fact, we had a bottle of champagne bet. The lead author who had published the first paper, he thought it would make the front page of the New York Times again, and he bet me a bottle of champagne. And I said, his name was Boris Worm. I said, Boris, this is never going to happen. It's bad news makes the front page. Sort of good news. No, and we were on, like, we made the New York Times about page 23. I guarantee you we weren't on the BBC Evening News. And so to this day, you can find all fish will be gone by mid-century all over the web. So, and so there's a very strong uh, bias in what gets published in scientific journals, and uh, and there's a very strong bias in what gets covered in the media.
which is really, really frustrating for men who are, it's their livelihoods and their investments and
Oh yeah, yeah, no,
just
and
trying.
the problem is it really makes its way into public policy. So the U.S. has a very good fisheries management system, but it is also extremely cautious. Uh, and part of that is, um, no scientist has been embarrassed by under harvesting a fish stock. But if you look at the scientists who were involved in the assessment of the cod in Canada, it was catastrophic for them personally. I mean, they were um, and so the science community has been very, very cautious in places where in terms of the strategy. So, for instance, in the U.S., there's we can estimate for each stock a harvest rate that would produce long-term maximum yield, and so traditionally that would be your target harvest rate. Um, But the U.S., largely under advice from the scientists, has adopted a policy of never fishing that hard. That is the absolute limit on how hard you can fish. Not that that should be the average level you fish, which is how you would maximize yield. So as a result, I mean, and there are reasons you might want to do that. You maintain a higher stock biomass, etc. But the result is that we are very, very cautious in how we manage fisheries, because from the manager's point of view, you're not going to you're not going to be embarrassed by being cautious, but you might be embarrassed if you do uh, fish too hard.
Yeah, totally get that. Yeah. No, yeah, I don't know if it was ever seen out in the US, but you mentioned the prediction about 2048. That was used here in a documentary called Seaspiracy.
Oh yeah. I mean, see, yeah, and Seaspiracy was a very, very big deal in the U.S. It was one of the most popular things on Netflix, and it got millions and millions of viewers. And it was one of the most bogus quote documentaries ever produced. Um, and we spent a lot of time on critiquing it and refuting it, and we have a website that at the time it came out, we were averaging about 20,000 views a month. And the month after Seaspiracy came out, we had 200,000 views of people looking for reliable scientific information on the claims made in Seaspiracy. I mean, it was ridiculous. That, basically they claimed that no fishing is sustainable. Uh, um, and I have to say, even some of the most anti-fishing uh, scientists who were sort of came out saying no, Seaspiracy is not true. There were a couple. Well, I wouldn't even call them reputable scientists, but there were a couple people who would claim to be scientists who really supported its message. But 99% of people who know anything about fisheries in the oceans really rejected the claims of Seaspiracy. But it was very effective.
That's for sure. Yeah, I mean, how they could quite willingly put, uh, I mean, endanger the lives and occupations of millions of people around the world just for veganism. Yeah, yeah, no. It's been really interesting talking to you today, Ray. I'm very much at one with your, I'm very much at one with your views, that's for sure. And it's refreshing to actually speak to somebody with scientist or doctor or professor that actually has such a realistic, down to earth view rather than. So it's very refreshing.
Well, I mean, my perspective on these issues is not in any sense unique to me, and there's certainly many scientists who work in fisheries, and probably most in the UK, that would tell you something very similar. I mean, one of the problems is that those who work for the government agencies usually are not free to talk in the way that I can. But there's certainly other academics in the UK I can point you to who are familiar with these subjects and would tell you similar things, but they would know much more about specific UK fisheries or fisheries issues than I do.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting to hear.
Yeah,
And when see with the salmon, you're saying is it sockeye? You said was the biggest.
yeah, that was the most valuable salmon fishery in the United States, and we just had the best return in history.
Oh, is coho as big?
Oh no, nothing. I mean, a few percent of the sockeye. A coho is not a big wild species. I mean, it's significant in some places, but I think the total catch of coho salmon might be 5% of the catch of sockeye salmon.
Yeah.
It's also not as good.
Eh, okay. Okay. I I was we've holidayed a lot, and when our family were younger in Florida, and any of the seafood restaurants we would go to there, majority of their fish came from Seattle.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're the home of the Alaska fishing fleet, and that's where a lot of it comes. All the North Pacific fish come through Seattle.
It must be a massive operation there as a port, and
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, both the salmon fishery and the pollock fishery are both pretty high volume fisheries, and so just for so in Bristol Bay, where the big sockeye fishery, there's about 10 processing plants that they process. Got I mean, the problem is we do stupid things in pounds and not tons. But let me think. So if you do 300 million, well, let's see. No, let's say the average, we did 60 million fish this year, average weight of, let's say, 3 kilos. 60, that would be 180 million kilos would be 180,000 tons. Yeah, 180,000 tons in uh, in 3 weeks because it's a very short season.
wow,
Yeah,
is that right?
yeah. And and I went to one of the biggest pollock plant, and they do several million pounds a day. So several million pounds would be divided by 2,000, more or less, would be well, if they do 3 million pounds a day, then that would be one and a half, 150. Got to do my arithmetic here. 3 million. Anyway, it's just these gigantic processing plants. So, they're volumes that certainly I don't think the UK has seen in decades.
Oh, that's for sure. Yeah. What's your views on Alaskan pollock as a fish to eat?
I don't eat it a lot because I can afford more expensive fish, but it's very good, and it's very low environmental impact. I mean, I recently went to one of the plants with my wife that was producing the value added products, the fish and chips and things like that, and I was very impressed by how good it was. Um, and you can't find and it's such a low impact fish. I've got a slide I use to compare a pollock burger, which is what you would get if you went to a McDonald's in the U.S. and got a fish sandwich. Compare that to the so-called impossible burger that's made from plants. And a pollock burger has about a quarter of the carbon footprint and about a hundredth of the water demand of an impossible burger. And the idea that a vegan diet by eating something like an impossible burger is lower impact than a fish diet is just totally bogus.
I love the term impossible burger.
Mm.
You're a fisherman's friend using that one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. No, well, Ray, I'd like to just maybe fold up and thank you very much for coming on with us. It's really been fascinating, and I love your views on things, and it's refreshing to hear your views on it. So thank you for
Okay.
coming
No,
along.
it's been a pleasure. And yeah, get in touch with me again if you want to talk again.
Thank you for listening to Seafood Matters podcast. You can subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. You can join me on Instagram and Facebook by searching for @Seafood Matters podcast. If you have any questions or episode suggestions, please email me at jim@seafoodmatterspodcast.com or get in touch through my website, seafoodmatterspodcast.com.